Hello, welcome to Healthcare in a Transcultural Environment, MOT 115. Today we're going to introduce the idea of transcultural communications. So let's start off with the concept of culturally competent care. What does that mean? Well, it's defined by the American Academy of Nursing as a complex integration of knowledge, attitudes, and skills that enhances cross-cultural communication, appropriate and effective interactions. It involves, and we're going to start at the top at 12 o'clock for those of you who know the clock. Cultural awareness. You have to examine your own cultural background. Do you understand where you come from? Do you understand how it overlaps with the culture that you live within? Then going down to just about 3 o'clock, cultural knowledge, i.e. gaining an understanding of other cultures. This is a really important thing in any field that you work in, but especially healthcare, because we're talking about something that's so inherently personal and family oriented as our healthcare, and it's important to understand how the different cultures treat healthcare and health issues. Going down to about 5 o'clock, cultural skills, which is the ability to collect relevant cultural data and perform culturally specific assessments. Again, depending on your patient, your client, you're going to be dealing with different issues, and someone who comes from the United States, born and bred, raised here, is going to have a much different perspective on healthcare than somebody who's come from a third world country or even somebody from the Middle East. Moving along, cultural encounters, and this is directly interacting with diverse cultural backgrounds, and there's different ways you can do this. When we live near a big city like Philadelphia, there's always different cultural events going on, whether it is a parade, a food festival. There are a dozen different ways to get to know and understand different cultures. And then finally, cultural desires. The genuine passion to be open to other cultures and accepting and respecting differences. What this means is that you don't look at a culture as odd or weird because it's unusual to you. It's an opportunity to learn about this culture and to be interested in learning about other cultures. So we're going to talk about these two terms, dyad and communication. Start with dyad, which is interaction between two people, which is the most common form of communication in a healthcare setting. Communication is an exchange process, not a one-sided delivery of information. So what we have to think about here is these are conversational styles, and when we communicate, it's not just the person who is making the statement or the person who is listening to the statement. It's that exchange of information. So here's a picture called the transactional model of communication. And just to kind of brief you a little bit on these terms, the noise that you see between them is anything that could be interruptions, it could be loud noises coming from another room, it could be loud music, it could be our own thoughts and problems that are consuming us. So a communicator starts off by encoding their message, either how they present it verbally, in writing, text message. The message is sent through a channel, and that channel can be either verbal, in writing, in some sort of abbreviated way, and then the person who receives the message has to decode that message. So, somebody that you're very close to and that you know very well, it's going to be fairly easy to decode what they're trying to say. However, if you don't know that person very well and they're giving you an explanation or they're trying to explain something to you, you might have no clue what they're talking about because you don't know how to decode that message. So what are we missing here? We're missing that feedback loop. And that's the important thing, is that we always have to make sure we get the message that either our client is giving us or that we're giving our client. So, and again, the sender encodes the message. It uses a channel to transfer the message, be it verbal, email, phone. The receiver must decode the message, and it works most effectively when feedback is utilized to ensure the message was properly decoded. This all comes down to the idea of communication is only effective if it is understood by both sides. So let's talk about the concept of noise in a little more detail. And this is anything that can get in the way of the message being decoded properly. We have our physical noise, such as the static on a cell phone, psychological noise, that defensiveness or our attitude about something. If your spouse says, "We need to talk," you immediately get that sinking feeling in your stomach and you're like, "Oh no." And you might get defensive, you might get an attitude. We all do these things. Then there's the physiological noise. If you have a hearing deficit, if you have a hard time understanding accents, sometimes you have a hard time with people who, they're shy, so they speak into their hands. There is a variety of noise that often gets in the way of us decoding a message properly. So let's talk about some barriers to communication. We have on the left-hand side, your email is going off, that beeping noise, your dog is barking, your teapot or your coffee maker is beeping, and you're trying to send a message. And then the receiver is also dealing with their noise in terms of, is that the call I'm expecting? Who's at the door? Why, didn't I send that email sooner? There is so much that goes on during the day that pulls our attention away from what we're actually doing, which oftentimes creates a huge barrier to communicating effectively, especially when we're trying to send out a succinct and important message. So let's talk about language. There are approximately 6,000 languages spoken around the world. The three most common are, number one, Mandarin Chinese, with over 800 million speakers, keeping in mind that China has about 1.3 billion people living there. English, with over 400 million speakers, and Spanish, with 300 million, and Hindi, which is a language spoken in India, also with 300 million speakers. So our big languages tend to dominate countries with huge populations. India also has about 1.2 billion people. So you'll see that between the Chinese and the people from India, that's almost a third of the people on Earth. So, in addition to languages, we also deal with body language. Body language is the process of communication through sending and receiving wordless messages. It can be communicated through gesture and touch, by body language or posture, by facial expression and eye contact, through object communication such as clothing, hairstyles, or even architecture. So if you think about it, and this is within the context of even, a very small part of your life, how you dressed in high school oftentimes represented who you wanted to be seen as. Same thing with if your child is not making eye contact with you. They're up to something. And, oftentimes when there are no words to console you over something you're upset about, having someone just hold your shoulder or give you a hug is more than enough communication. In terms of our communication process, what we really communicate to people is more on the nonverbal side than on the verbal side. So 55% of what people remember tends to be nonverbal, or at least that's how they're interpreting messages. 38% is our tone of voice. So when your teenager is being snarky to you and you're like, you better watch that tone, missy. And they're like, what? I didn't say anything. And again, we as the parents then to smack them up to the moon. And I'm not advocating violence. But you get that tone of voice, and we have all been there. And then finally, only about 7% of what we're actually saying is being communicated effectively. So what is your hidden language saying? You know, if you're dressed in a suit, you're going to have a very particular way of presenting yourself versus someone who's in jeans and a sweatshirt. Now, it doesn't mean you're better or worse than somebody. It just means that you want the world to see you in a very specific, particular way. So now we're going to move on and talk about Paul Ekman's 1960 studies on facial expressions that determined that certain expressions are in fact universal. If you've seen the movie Inside Out, which is a cartoon from Pixar, and again, these characters that you see on the screen are from this movie, they represent some of the universal expressions that we all deal with. So we have surprise, sadness, joy, anger, fear, and disgust. And these represent whether you're in the deepest parts of the Bolivian jungle, or you're in Montana, China, Switzerland, people's expressions tend to be the same when exhibiting these particular emotional contexts. So, starting with the top left, anger. Eyebrows drawn down and together, eyes tend to glare, narrowing of the lips. You'll notice the lips almost completely disappear. Then we have disgust, where your nose is wrinkled and your upper lip is raised as if you're smelling something that is horrendous. Then we have fear, where your eyebrows are raised and pulled together. You raise your upper eyelids. You have tensed lower eyelids and lips slightly stretched horizontally back to the ears. And again, the fear is this idea that your body is constricting away from whatever it's afraid of. Happiness, crow's feet wrinkles, those are those happy smile lines at your eyes. Pushed up cheeks, because the muscles in your face to smile are going to push up the muscles in your cheek. And the movement from muscles that orbits the eyes. So, you know, all of these things that go into how we appear happy are muscular in a sense in terms of, you know, just lifting our face up completely. Then we have sadness, which is the drooping upper eyelids, losing focus in the eyes, and slight pulling down of lip corners. So sadness, the face is completely relaxed, you look sad, and more than anything else, there's no attempt to move your face in any particular direction. Then we have surprise with your eyebrows raised, eyes widened, and mouth open. Now later, Ekman added a few more universal expressions, contempt being the one that is demonstrated here. Is the corners tightened and raised for only one side of the face. This is that, yeah, you think you're all that, you're not. It's the contemptuousness. Now this slide is from the TV show Lie to Me, which is no longer on television, but it was a man who studied micro expressions. And these micro expressions, which are important for any healthcare provider to realize, accept, and embrace, are going to help you identify what problems you're having with the patient when they're not explaining things well. Sometimes their body language can tell what they're verbally saying. Research has suggested that between 60 and 70% of all meaning is derived from nonverbal behavior. Argyll in 1970 put forward the hypothesis that whereas spoken language is normally used for communicating information, nonverbal codes are used to communicate attitudes. So, who is better at nonverbal communication, men or women? On average, to a moderate degree, women are better at nonverbal communication than men. Why do you think this is true? And at this point, women also are much more socially engineered to express emotion. Men are supposed to be stoic. Women are allowed to cry. They're allowed to throw their emotions out to their friends without any repercussions. Whereas a man, if he starts talking about his emotional center, his friends might be like, dude, what's wrong with you? So while we're mulling over male and female communication and nonverbal communication, we're going to talk next about why transcultural communication is so important. Number one, increasing ethnic, racial, and cultural diversity in the composition of the U.S. population. Depending on where you live in the country will determine the cultures that you are coming into contact with. So for example, in Philadelphia, we have a large African American population, a large Puerto Rican population. We also have immigrants who have come over from West Africa. Additionally, previous immigration groups include the Irish, the Italians, the Russians, and Ukrainians. So you tend to see a lot of different kinds of cultures all coalescing in the Northeast. Then we have our smaller cultures like the Amish and the Mennonites, both of which are religious organizations that have a very strong, distinct culture that is unique to this area. Now, if you go down to, for example, Arizona or New Mexico, you're going to see a lot more Native Americans. If you go out to California, you're going to see a lot more Mexican Americans. So again, when we are examining where we are in this country, we also have to understand that certain cultures have gravitated to certain areas. For example, you go out to Minnesota and everybody's German and Swedish and Norwegian and Icelandic because that's where they went after they immigrated to this part of the country. Number two, patients have a variety of expectations and behaviors within the context of healthcare. If you have somebody who is from another country, say, for example, the Middle East, and they are part of a strict Islamic sect, they may not allow a male doctor to examine a female patient, or vice versa. A female patient or a female doctor would not be appropriate for a male patient. And again, we as an American kind of believe, well, everybody's equal. But the reality is we have to make sure our patients are comfortable. So if possible, we try to make things easier for them by accommodating them. But that's not always going to be possible. Also, number three, health issues have cultural meaning within specific societies. So, for example, we have in some cultures, if a man has problems with erectile dysfunction, that may, be a message in the culture that he is no longer a man. And nowadays we have all kinds of meds that'll help, but in previous generations, this was oftentimes the end of a man feeling like he had any kind of authority in his life. Other cultural issues that we address, if you have somebody who's been diagnosed with stage 3 or stage 4 cancer, there is a chance that they could recover, but some cultures that are fatalistic, believe that destiny is already written in the stars, they may pass on any interventions because they don't want to mess with God's plan. And again, you have some religions that don't believe in blood transfusions, that don't believe in vaccines, that don't believe in any kind of surgical intervention. Number 4, level of adherence and compliance with treatment often depends upon integrating specific cultural factors such as religious interventions. So if you have someone who is a very spiritually minded individual and you need them to follow a very strict medication regime that involves them violating the determination to fast during Ramadan, for example, in the Islamic culture, you have to learn how to work with them and understand enough about Islam to know that Allah has given exception to people who are sick, people who are children, people who are pregnant, women who are pregnant. Number 5, the concept of health varies from culture to culture. Whereas one culture might believe that having your toe turn purple is a bad thing, another culture might believe that that is just God's will and you have to live with it. Number 6, healthcare has a commitment to humanistic and humane treatment for patients. Remember, the first requirement is to do no harm. So we want to look at each patient as an individual who has their own needs, their own culture, their own experiences, and we have to respect that. So here's the census data from 2010, and the next time the census is coming out is 2020. So we'll get some more information in a few years. 64% of the population in the United States is identified as Caucasian or white. 12% for African Americans or blacks, 16% for Hispanics, 5% for Asians, 1% American Indians and Eskimos, and 2% are self-identified as biracial, meaning mom might have been African American and dad was Asian. 35 million Americans speak Spanish primarily in their homes, and that is over 10% of the population, which is why being bilingual in the United States, especially with Spanish, can almost guarantee a job. Almost. 7 million Americans speak an Asian-based language in their home. So that's a pretty significant number as well. So if you are an immigrant who's come from another country and who has mastered English, you've already created a skill set for yourself in terms of being able to translate for others. So when you communicate with a patient or client from another culture, you need to know how and when to start the conversation, how best to be understood. For example, you may need an interpreter. How to respond to a patient's gestures or questions. In some countries, nodding is actually saying no. So in Bulgaria, for example, when you want to say yes, you shake your head. You want to say no, you nod your head. So again, knowing a little bit about the culture can even identify certain non-verbal gestures that may be confusing to you. How to be sensitive to the patient's reactions. If somebody doesn't want you to work with them because you are a specific gender or a specific nationality or race or religion, you need to be sensitive to why this is occurring. What is the cultural background? It may not make sense to you, you may not like it, but the reality is people have, particular cultural things that make them more comfortable with certain types of people more than others. Now, if you have somebody who's just discriminatory or prejudiced, that's a different issue. You have to learn how to listen to patients' concerns. Learning how to listen is oftentimes the hardest thing for most people. And how to take the patient's illness and health-related beliefs into consideration as you plan their care. If you have a patient who's a strong believer in Eastern medicine, you may need to coordinate your health care with their person who gives them cupping or does Reiki with them or does sage smudging. And even though you may not be an advocate, this is something that they will feel more comfortable with. So that's it for today. If you have any questions, please email or text message your instructor. If you're not at our school but are still interested and have a question, please leave a comment and we will respond as quickly as we can. Thank you and have a fabulous day.